Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to start part 2 of Little Blue Book number 19, and it is titled Nietzsche, Who He Was and What He Stood For, written by Will Durant, PhD. And as you can tell, this book is falling apart. That is just the cover. There's the back cover. And then here's the book, and as you can tell right there, along the edging, you can see where it's breaking. The pages are so brittle. Luckily, I have several copies of this. Okay, so, anyhow, we left off at the top of page 24, and that's where we'll pick up. And then, in 1876, came Bayreuth itself, and Wagnerian opera, night after night, without cuts, and wagonines, and emperors, and princes, and princelets, and the idle rich crowding out the impetuous devotees. Suddenly it dawned upon Nietzsche how much of Gare there was in Wagner, how much the ring of the Nibelungs owed to the theatrical effects which abounded in it, and how far the mellows that some missed in the music had passed into the drama. I had had visions of a drama overspread with a symphony, a form of growing out of the lied, but the alien appeal of the opera drew Wagner irresistibly in the other direction. Nietzsche could go in that direction. He detested the dramatic and the operatic. I should be insane to stay here, he wrote. I await with terror each of these long musical evenings. I can bear no more. And so he fled, without a word to Wagner, and in the midst of Wagner's supreme triumph, while all the world worshipped, fled, tired with disgust of all that is feminism and undisciplined rhapsody, in that romanticism, that idealistic lying, that softening of the human conscience, which had conquered here one of the bravest souls. And then, in faraway Sorrento, whom should he encounter but Wagner himself, resting from his victory and full of the new opera he was writing, Parsifal. It was to be an exaltation of Christianity, pity, and fleshless love, in a world redeemed by a pure fool, the fool in Christ. Nietzsche turned away without a word and never spoke to Wagner thereafter. It is impossible for me to recognize greatness which is not united with candor and sincerity towards oneself. The moment I make a discovery of this sort, a man's achievements count for absolutely nothing with me. He preferred Siegfried and the rebel to Parsifal the saint, and could not forgive Wagner for coming to see in Christianity a moral value and beauty far outweighing its theological defects. In the case of Wagner, he lays about him with neurotic fury. Wagner flatters every nihilistic Buddhistic instinct and disguises it in music. He flatters every kind of Christianity and every religious form and expression of decadence. Richard Wagner, a decrepit and desperate romantic, collapsed suddenly before the Holy Cross. There was no German then with eyes to see, with pity in his conscience to bewail this horrible spectacle. And am I then the only one he caused to suffer? And yet I was the one of the most corrupt Wagnerians. Well, I am the child of this age, just like Wagner, i.e. a decadent, but I am conscious of it. I defend myself against it. Nietzsche was more Apollonian. There we go, Apollonian. Nietzsche was more Apollonian than he supposed, a lover of the subtle and delicate and refined, not of wild Dionysian vigor, nor of the tenderness of wine and song and love. Your brother, with his air of delicate distinction, is a most uncomfortable fellow, said Wagner to Frau Forster Nietzsche. Sometimes he is quite embarrassed at my jokes, and then I crack them more madly than ever. There was so much of Plato in Nietzsche. He feared that art would unteach men to be hard, being tender-minded. He supposed that all the world was like himself, dangerously near to practicing Christianity. There had not been wars enough to suit his gentle professor. And yet, in his quiet hours, he knew that Wagner was as right as Nietzsche, that Parsifal's gentleness was a necessary as Siegfried's strength, and that in some cosmic way these cruel oppositions merged into wholesome creative unities. He liked to think of this stellar friendship that still bound him silently to the man who had been the most valuable and fruitful experience of his life, and when, in a lucid moment of his final insanity, he drew a picture of the long-dead Wagner, he said softly, "Him I loved much." That's the end of chapter 3. On to chapter 4. Ooh. Big words that I never heard of before. It confound 9 out of 10 brain cells. The 10th one wasn't paying attention and missed the question. So, chapter 4, the Song of Zarathustra. 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 And now, from art, which seemed to have failed him, he took refuge in science, whose cold Apollonian air cleansed his soul after the Dionysian heat and riot of Tribetion and Bayreuth, and in philosophy, which offers an asylum where no tyranny can penetrate. Like Spinoza, he tried to calm his emotions by examining them. We need, he said, a chemistry of the emotions. And so, in his next book, Humans All Too Human, 1878 to 1880, he became psychologist. He became psychologist and analyzed with a surgeon's ruthlessness the tenderest feelings and the most cherished beliefs, dedicating it all bravely in the midst of reaction to the scandalous Voltaire. He sent volumes to Wagner and received in return the book of Parsifal. They never communicated again. And then, at the very prime of life in 1879, he broke down physically and mentally and sank into the vicinity of death. He prepared for the end defiantly. "Promise me," he said to his sister, "that when I die, only my friends shall stand about my coffin, and no inquisitive crowd. See that no priest or anyone else utter falsehoods at my graveside, when I can no longer protect myself. And let me descend into my tomb as an honest pagan." But he recovered, and this heroic funeral had to be postponed. Out of such illness came his love of health and the sun, of life and laughter and dance, and Carmen's music of the South. Out of it, too, came a stronger will, born of fighting death, a yea-saying that felt life's sweetness, even in its bitterness and pain. And out of it, perhaps, a pitiful effort to rise to Spinoza's in Inquantiamus. It looks like Latin. The cheerful acceptance of natural limitations and human destiny. My formula for greatness is amor fati, not only to bear up under every necessity, but to love it. Alas, it is more easily said than done. The title of his next books, The Dawn of Day, 1881, and The Joyful Wisdom, 1882, reflect a grateful convalescence. Here is a kindler tone and a gentler tongue than in the later books. Now he had a year of quiet days, living modestly on the pension his university had given him. The proud philosopher could even thaw into a pretty frailty and find himself suddenly in love. But Lou Salome did not return his love. His eyes were too sharp and deep for comfort. Paul Ree was less dangerous and played Dr. Pelagio to Nietzsche's de Musset. Nietzsche fled in despair, composing aphorisms against women as he went. In truth, he was naive, enthusiastic, romantic, tender to simplicity. His war against tenderness was an attempt to exercise a virtue which had led to a bitter deception and to a wound that never healed. He could not find solitude enough now. It is difficult to live with men because silence is difficult. He passed from Italy to the heights of the Alps at Sils Maria, in the upper Engadine, loving not man nor woman neither, and praying that man might be surpassed. And there, on the lonely heights, came the inspiration of his greatest book. I sat there waiting for nothing, enjoying beyond good and evil now. The light now, the shade. There was only the day, the lake, the noon. Time with, and I can't read it because it's like scribble print. Then my friend, suddenly one, became two, and Zarathustra passed by me. I don't know, it must have been a little poem he wrote. Now his soul rose and overflowed all its margins. He had found a new teacher, Zoroaster, a new god, the Superman, and a new religion, eternal recurrence. He must sing now. Philosophy mounted into poetry under the adder of his inspiration. I could sing a song and will sing it, although I am not alone in an empty house and must sing it into mine own ears. What loneliness is in that phrase. Thou great star, what would be thy happiness, were it not for those for whom thou shinest? Lo, I am weary of my wisdom, like the bee that hath collected too much honey. I need hands reaching out for it. So he wrote, Thus Spake Zarathustra, 1883, and finished it in what hallowed hour when Richard Wagner gave up the ghost in Venice. It was his magnificent answer to Paris Fall, but the maker of Paris Fall was dead. It was his masterpiece, and he knew it. This work stands alone, he wrote of it later. Do not let us mention the poets in the same breath. Nothing perhaps had ever been produced out of such a superabundance of strength. If all the spirit and goodness of every great soul were collected together, the whole could not create a single one of Zarathustra's discourses. A slight exaggeration, and I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. Zarathustra. But assuredly, it is one of the great books of the 19th century. Yet Nietzsche had a bitter time getting it into print. The first part was delayed because the publishers' presses were busy with an order for 500,000 hymn books, and then by a stream of anti-Semitic pamphlets. And the publisher refused to print the last part at all, and quite worthless from the point of view of shekels. And so the author had to pay for its publication himself. 40 copies of the book were sold. 7 were given away. 1 acknowledged it. No one praised it. Never was a man so much alone. Zarathustra, aged 30, comes down from his meditative mountain to preach to the crowd, like his Parisian prototype, Zoroaster. But the crowd turns from him to see a rope walker perform. The rope walker falls and dies. Zarathustra takes him upon his shoulder and carries him away. Because thou hast made danger thy calling, therefore shall I bury thee with my own hands. Live dangerously, he preaches. Erect your cities beside Vesuvius. Send out your ships to unexplored seas. Live in a state of war. And remember to disbelieve. Zarathustra, coming down from the mountain, meets an old hermit who talks to him about God. But when Zarathustra was alone, he spake thus with his heart. Can it actually be possible? This old saint in his forest hath not yet heard aught of God being dead. But of course God was dead. All the gods were dead. And it's like a bit of poetry written next. For the old gods came to an end long ago, and verily it was a good and joyful end of gods. They did not die lingering in the twilight, although that lie is told. On the contrary, they once upon a time laughed themselves unto death. They came to pass when, by a god himself, the most ungodly word was uttered. The word, there is but one God. Thou shalt have no other God before me. An old grim beard of a god, a jealous one, forget himself thus. And then all gods laughed and shook on their chairs and cried, It's godlessness. It's godliness, not just that there are gods, but no God. Whoever hath ears, let him hear. Thus spoke Zarathustra. What hilarious atheism! Not strictly and literally consistent. It's not just this godliness that there are no gods. What could be created if there were gods? If there were gods, how could I bear to be no God? Man, makes no sense in these sentences. Consequently, there are no gods. I'm pretty high, and that didn't make any sense. Who is more ungodly than I, that I may enjoy his teachings? I conjure you, my brethren, remain faithful to earth, and do not believe those who speak unto you of super-terrestrial hopes. Poisoners they are, whether they know it or not. Many an erstwhile rebel returns to the sweet poison at last, as a necessary anesthesia for life. The higher men gather in Zarathustra's cave to prepare themselves to preach his doctrine. He leaves them for a while and returns to find them offering incense to a donkey who has created the world in his own image, i.e., as stupid as possible. This is not edifying. But then, says our text, he who must be a creator in good and evil, verily he must first be a destroyer and break values into pieces. Thus the highest evil is part of the highest goodness, but that is creative goodness. Let us speak therein, ye wisest men, however bad it be. To be silent is worse. All unuttered truths become poisonous. And whatever while break on our truths, let it break. Many a house hath yet to be built. Thus spake Zarathustra. No wonder the book didn't sell. And is this irreverent? But Zarathustra complains that nobody knoweth any longer how to reverie, and he calls himself the most pious of all those who believe not in God. He longs for belief and pities all who, like myself, suffer from the great loathing, for whom the old God died, and no new God yet lieth in cradles and napkins. And then he pronounces the name of the new God. Back into the reading of the book. Dead are all gods. Now we will that Superman live. I teach you, Superman. Man is a something that shall be surpassed. What have ye done to surpass him? What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. What can be loved in man? That is, he is a transition and a destruction. I love those who do not know how to live except in perishing, for they are those going beyond. I love the great despisers because they are the great adorers. They are arrows of longing for other shores. I love those who do not seek beyond the stars for a reason to perish and be sacrificed, but who sacrifice themselves to Earth in order that Earth may someday become Superman's. It is time for man to mark his goal. It is time for man to plant and germ of his highest hope. And sadly, the Superman he's talking about is not the DC comic. Tell me, my brethren, if the goal be lacking to humanity, is not humanity itself lacking? Love unto the most remote man is higher than love unto your neighbor. Nietzsche. Strange fellow. Nietzsche appears to foresee that every reader will think himself the Superman, and tries to guard against this by confessing that the Superman is not yet born. We can only be his forerunners and his soil. Well, nothing beyond your capacity. Be not virtuous beyond your ability, and demand nothing of yourselves contrary to probability. Not for us is the happiness, which only the Superman will know. Our best goal is work. For a long time I ceased not to strive for my happiness. Now I strive for my work. Nietzsche is not content with having created God in his own image. He must make himself immortal. After the Superman comes eternal recurrence. All things will return in precise detail and an infinite number of times. Even Nietzsche will return, and this Germany of blood and iron and sackcloth and ashes, and all the travail of the human mind from ignorance to Zarathustra. It is a terrible doctrine, the last and most courageous form of yea-saying and the acceptance of life. And yet how could it be? How could it not be? The possible combinations of reality are limited, and time is endless. Someday, inevitably, life and matter will fall into just such a form as they once had, and out of that fatal repetition, all history must unwind its devious course again. To such a past determinism brings us. No wonder Zarathustra feared to speak this his last lesson, feared and trembled and held back until a voice spoke to him. What matter about thyself, Zarathustra? Say thy word and break in pieces. Such a strange man. Ooh, that's the end of chapter 4. Ooh, pardon me. Oh, and I did forget to say this was copyright 1924. Ay. Cottonmouth. Brain bake. And on to chapter 5. Hero morality. Zarathustra became for Nietzsche a gospel, whereupon his later books were merely commentaries. If Europe would not appreciate his poetry, perhaps it would understand his prose. After the song of the prophet, the logic of the philosopher. What thought the philosopher himself should disbelieve in logic? It is a tool of clarity, if not the seal of proof. He was more than ever alone now, for Zarathustra had seemed a little queer even to Nietzsche's friends, scholars like Overbeck and Burckhardt, who had been his colleagues at Basel and had admired the birth of tragedy, mourned the loss of a brilliant philologist, and could not celebrate the birth of a poet. His sister, who had almost justified his view that for a philosopher a sister is an admirable substitute for a wife, left him suddenly to marry one of those anti-Semites whom Nietzsche despised, and went off to Paraguay to find a communistic colony. She asked her pale, frail brother to come along, for the sake of his health. But Nietzsche valued the life of the mind more than the health of the body. He wished to stay where the battle was. Europe was necessary to him as a culture museum. He lived irregularly in place and time. He tried Switzerland and Venice and Genoa and Nice and Turin. He liked to write amid the doves that flock about the lions of St. Mark's. This Piazza San Marco is my finest workroom. But he had to follow Hamlet's advice about staying out of the sun, which hurt his ailing eyes. He shut himself up in dingy, heatless attics, and worked behind closed blinds because of his eyes. He wrote henceforth no books, but only aphorisms. He gathered some of these fragments together under the titles Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, and The Genealogy of Morals, 1887. He hoped in these volumes to destroy the old morality and prepare the way for the morality of the Superman. For a moment, he became the philologist again and sought to enforce his new ethic with etymologies that are not quite beyond reproach. He observes that the German language contains two words for bad, schlecht and böse. Schlecht was applied by the upper to the lower classes and meant ordinary, common. Later it came to mean vulgar and worthless. And bad. Böse was applied to the lower by the lower to the upper classes and meant unfamiliar, irregular, incalculable, dangerous, harmful, cruel. Napoleon was blasé. Many simple peoples feared the exceptional individual as a disintegrating force. There is a Chinese proverb that the great man is a public misfortune. Likewise, gut had two meanings, as opposite to schlecht and böse. As used by the aristocracy, it meant strong, brave, powerful, warlike, godlike, gut from Gott. As used by the people, it meant familiar, peaceful, harmless, kind. Hence, then, were two contradictory valuations of human behavior, two ethical standpoints and criteria, a Herren moral and a Herden moral, a morality of masters and a morality of the herd. The former was the accepted standard in classical antiquity, especially among the Romans. Even for the ordinary Romans, virtue was virtus, manhood, courage, enterprise, bravery. But from Asia, and especially from the Jews in the days of their political subjection, came the other standard. Subjection breeds humility, helplessness, breeds altruism, which is an appeal for help. Under this herd morality, love of danger and power gave way to love of security and peace. Strength was replaced by cunning, open by secret revenge, sternness by pity, initiative by imitation, the pride of honor by the whip of conscience. Honor is pagan, Roman, feudal, aristocratic. Conscience is Jewish, Christian, bourgeoisie, democratic. It was the eloquence of the prophets, from Amos to Jesus, that made the view of a subject class an almost universal ethic. The world and the flesh became synonymous of evil and poverty, a proof of virtue. This valuation was brought to a peak by Jesus. With him, every man was of equal worth and had equal rights. Out of his doctrine came democracy, utilitarianism, socialism. Progress was now defined in terms of these plebeian philosophies, in terms of progressive equalization and vulgarization, in terms of decadence and descending life. The final stage in this decay is the exaltation of pity and self-sacrifice, the sentimental comforting of criminals, the inability of a society to excrete. Sympathy is legitimate if it is active, but pity is a paralyzing mental luxury, a waste of feeling for the irremediably botched, the incompetent, the defective, the vicious, the culpably diseased, and the irrevocably criminal. There is a certain indelicacy and intrusiveness in pity. Visiting the sick is an organism of superiority in the contemplation of our neighbor's helplessness. Behind all this morality is the secret will to power. Love itself is only a desire for possession. Courtship is combat, and mating is mastery. Don Jose kills Carmen to prevent her from becoming the property of another. People imagine that they are unselfish in love because they seek the advantage of another being, often in opposition of their own. But for so doing, they want to possess the other being. Even the love of truth is the desire to possess it, perhaps to be the first possessor, to find it virginal. Humility is the protective coloration of the will of power. I think we'll stop there. Pardon me. And that will stop on the top of page 43. And that concludes this part 2 of Nietzsche, who he was and what he stood for. Little Blue Book number 19. Copyright 2019, copyright 1924. Thanks for listening, and join me in